morning. I'm Lloyd Whitman, the new Senior Director of the Atlantic Council, and today I'm pleased to host the launch of our report, Cybersecure the Future, Ransomware. The GeoTech Center at the Atlantic Council serves as an essential bridge between technologists and national as well as international policymakers. It brings together subject matter experts, thought leaders, and decision makers through purposeful convenings to consider the broader societal, economic, and geopolitical implications of new and emerging technologies, leverage technology to solve global challenges, and develop actionable technology policy, partnerships, and programs. So today we're here to talk about one such area, ransomware. I want to thank everyone who worked on this report. Trent Tima, a non-resident senior fellow, for leading the initiative to organize the roundtables, serving as the lead author of the report and moderating this launch event. David Bray, my predecessor and a distinguished fellow, for being an author on the report, being a panelist in the event, and for continuing to engage with the GeoTech Center to see this report over the finish line. Kieran Givnani, an assistant director in the GeoTech Center, for assisting Trent in organizing the roundtables, the launch event, and serving as an author. And finally, Emily Sespico, a project assistant who's helped with the review of the report and contributing to the glossary. So I'll thank the panelists in advance, who I won't name. You'll get introduced to them in a second. As we'll hear during this event, and as discussed in the report, in an interconnected world, digital threats have become increasingly common. Chief among them is ransomware, a malware-based cyber attack that encrypts files, rendering data inaccessible. This report endeavors to examine key challenges in predicting, safeguarding against, and dealing with ransomware attacks, thereby better informing U.S. and international policy to combat such attacks and their perpetrators. So with that, I'll now pass the baton to Kieran to further introduce the report.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's launch event. Ransomware itself has existed for over 2 decades, but it's really spiked over the last few years. And in fact, predictions show that by 2031, the costs associated with ransomware attacks are expected to reach new heights. Against this backdrop, the GeoTech Center convened subject matter experts from the cybersecurity industry and federal law enforcement agencies for a series of off-the-record roundtables. The objective of these roundtables was to really convene and allow these subject matter experts to speak freely on the issues surrounding ransomware. The GeoTech Center then compiled these conversations into a report, and today we are so pleased to present the findings and observations of this report. We're looking forward to having an insightful and lively discussion with all of you. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Trent Tima, a GeoTech Center non-resident fellow and the moderator of this event.
Well, hello. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. First of all, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everybody that contributed to the report. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Kieran and Dr. David, for everything we put into it. A lot of effort. Thank everybody at the Atlantic Council. It was a great effort, and especially the time and effort. So the interesting thing about the research and the way we approached this was we did 4 roundtables. We did 4 roundtables that were progressive, and we had a changing number of people that were subject matter experts from the Department of Justice, the FBI, the U.S. Secret Service, leading incident response companies, leading cryptocurrency companies, leading cyber defense, malware, intelligence companies, to all tease out what is ransomware and what can we do about it and how do we secure it. The first panel we did was dedicated to incident response. Second panel was to cyber threat intelligence. Third panel was to cryptocurrency, because you can't talk about ransomware without cryptocurrency. And then after that, we did an over the horizon to kind of see where it was going. The report, which I encourage you to please read, we broke it down into finding and observations, because what we try and do, as opposed to not being just another report, but with what our findings are and observations for action, so you can do something about it. The other thing about the report, and keep going, is it's much like the never-ending story, is because we keep adding to it, because it's an evolving problem, and we want to bring in thought leaders around this to figure out what we can do about it. So with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my guests, and we will go to I'd like to first introduce Dr. David Bray and let him say a few words, and then work through and let them give a background who they are before we jump into this whole report. David?
Well, great to see you, Trent, and congratulations for everything you've done to also get this across the finish line. I know this has been about a year in the making, and it's worth putting a little bit in context. This report was on the heels of what happened with the Colonial Pipeline attacks. Before that, while it was not believed to be ransomware, there was also SolarWinds. And so increasingly, the damage that can be done through cyber means was getting visibility. This was obviously before the events in Ukraine, where, of course, obviously there is now cyber activities happening there that may be extended beyond just those borders was occurring. It's also just worth noting that last year, it is believed, some estimates put $20 billion in damages as a result of ransomware globally. The year before that was about $11 billion in damages, and the year before that was $5 billion. So those are not good trends when we're essentially doubling year after year in terms of the damages associated with ransomware, which really point to what the GeoTech Center and what the Atlantic Council as a whole is trying to grapple with, which is, I tell people, the good news is technology is being democratized. The challenging news is that technology is getting democratized. That includes ransomware. It's getting easier and easier for people to do it. It's also worth putting in note, there were conversations that date back even as far as 2009, 2010. I know, Trent, back on the green stage, we're talking a little bit about Oxford, but Oxford was looking at measuring and mapping cybercrime as early as 2009 with the prediction that as we see more and more failed states, one way that those failed states will prop up their economy will be through more pervasive means of digital methods, of which ransomware is one way to actually support that. So again, kudos to you, Trent, for getting to where we are with this. It was an honor to be on the journey with you, initially with the GeoTech Center as its previous senior director. Really glad Lloyd is here now and he's steering the helm. And now as a distinguished fellow to see us now actually at the point where we can put this forward. And like you said, continue the ongoing dialogue that's lively, because we need to take action. Clearly, things are not going the right direction when we're past $20 billion in global damages. We have to do things differently. And this report, I think, sets the foundation for what can be things we can do differently as we move forward. With that, thank you, Trent.
Thank you very much, David. Next, I'll go to Michael Stawas. Mick Stawas at the U.S. Department of Justice, Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section, a good friend, and is kind enough to join us today. Mick, can you give us a brief background about who and what you are?
Sure. I just wanted to add my thanks to the Atlantic Council. The department, when we had a new administration, it was a priority for the new administration to evaluate the department, and we launched a comprehensive cyber review in April of 2021. And that was something that the department felt it was really important that we not just talk to the people within the department or our peers across different federal agencies, but also to the private sector. And those conversations with Trent and the Atlantic Council led to a series of roundtables that have greatly benefited the just recently announced report of the Department of Justice's comprehensive cyber review. This is a topic that is very important to us. We've put a lot of effort into it. We're trying to get better at our jobs. I don't take personal responsibility for the doubling and doubling over of ransomware, but it is true that I'm the Deputy Chief of Computer Crime, and in a leadership role, we are trying to address this, and we're not there yet. It's a very difficult problem, and so the insights of the report would be very helpful in having the department organize its efforts to be as effective as we can be. So thank you.
Thank you, Mick. And next, I'll go to Sherry Caddy, who's the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response for the U.S. Department of Energy. Wow. And thank you, Sherry. Toss it over to you.
Thanks, Trent. Yes, that's a mouthful. Yes, it's the cybersecurity agency within the Department of Energy, relatively new, recognizing that cybersecurity is really critical, increasingly critical for utilities. So I bring a lot of background. Been at the Department of Energy for 2 years, leading a number of different cyber initiatives, both using R&D. Of course, the Department of Energy has the largest federal R&D enterprise collectively with our DOE national labs, but also working on elements of operational coordination in cybersecurity as the sector risk management agency. So ransomware, of course, critical, how we deal with that, how we share information and get maybe the stigma attached with ransomware or just being hacked in general, away from that mental model for our for both our state local entities, utilities, as well as private sector, because we need to share information about these kinds of incidents and help better with the collective defense. So having that coordination with the Sector Risk Management Agency and of course with DHS as the collective around all of the sector agencies is really important going forward as we learn how to cooperate to counter this growing problem.
And I really appreciate Sherry taking the time to be with us today, because she's actually going to be dual hatted today. She's going to be one from the government's point of view on critical infrastructure, but also asked her to kind of role play a little bit from the owner operator, because that's a big perspective, because especially with the passage of the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act, not the official title, but functional, is that, if someone's the victim of a cyber attack, they have 24 hours to report now, and within 30 days if they have to pay. And what does that mean? And we'll talk about that later. But so she's going to help kind of play both positions on the field for that. And also she's also an alumni of cybersecurity directorate at the National Security Council, which we both did time together at. So thank you, Sherry, for being here. And John is joining us. Thank you very much for coming. And let me get the official title here. John is the research consultant, she's a research consultant at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative Digital Forensic Lab here at the Atlanta Council. And he's working on great research that is hopefully soon to be publishing. John?
Trent, I noticed you avoided my last name.
I was afraid of choking. I did it well in the green room, but it's
Oh, yeah, I'm John Sakalariadis. I'm a freelance technology journalist, but I spent the last year on a Fulbright research grant dedicated to studying ransomware. And so I have a report, an issue brief in Atlanta Council parlance that's coming out, I think, August 2nd, called Behind the Rise of Ransomware. And that report will do three things. It looks at the drivers of the surge in ransomware activity we've seen over the last 15 to 24 months or so. Part two looks at the last kind of year and change since Colonial Pipeline, when ransomware became a top of the agenda issue in Washington, D.C., and asks, why haven't we seen the improvement that we would expect, or at least hoped? And part three offers some recommendations for things the government could work on in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So why don't we go ahead and get started with the report? And the way the report's broken down is we have the full report, but at the very front of it in the executive summary, we have summary findings and a summary of observations, which makes it very useful so that you don't have to read the whole report. You can go right to the meat at the beginning and then dig into it when you have time to read it. So summary findings, you have like three major categories for findings, but we're going to jump right into what we found for summary observations for this discussion so that we can move it along. And I'll ask the panelists to jump in and as we tease it out. So observation 1.1 from the four panels was that there was a need to expand the traditional domestic public-private relationships, public-private partnerships to an international design. Because in the US, we're very US focused. We've been doing public-private partnerships for quite a long time across all the sectors, the ISACs, the critical infrastructure sectors, and it's really, really grown. But because the problem is international, we need to have an international way of sharing that data. So it comes to information sharing. And especially because of the transnational nature of ransomware schemes, this would help focus both private sector and law enforcement and governments to respond. It's because you're not doing it alone. And that's the problem. I think the US can't do it alone. So I open that up to the panel on observation one. Why don't I ask David, what do you think first, just to warm everybody up, and then we'll go there.
Well, I think what this observation really hits on is the transnational nature of ransomware, which makes it really hard. I sympathize with the job that Mike has to do and others, because oftentimes you're dealing with bad actors that are in countries where it's difficult to even get visibility as to who they are, what they're doing. And then once you can actually have confirmation it is them, they may not support them actually being extradited or things such as that. And so we've got to have this as a global approach, because if we only deal with it nationally, we will not succeed. And I think this is something that ransomware is just one example, but that's part of the challenge. And I also want to give kudos to the Department of Justice as well as to the FBI that, in some respects, if they hadn't been doing what they've been doing in the last decade, we may have seen this even worse now. So there's definitely stuff that's been done. It's just showing that now we have to play the game differently. And this is going to be one of the new ways we have to play the game differently, is think about it as a truly transnational activity.
No, I think that's great. And Mick, I'm going to go to you last because this is directly in your wheelhouse.
You get the final word.
John, what are your thoughts related to this versus domestic only or international public-private sector partnerships?
Yeah, I think David hit the key points. Something else I would flag, we tend to think of ransomware as a Russia problem. It's a huge driver of the problem today. I mean, I was actually looking at ransomware statistics this morning, and the volume of ransomware activity has declined since a date that should raise a eyebrow in anybody who's taking a look at this data, which is March, around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So clearly, the Russian sanctuary state is playing a big role in this ecosystem. However, as we think about the long-term trajectory of this problem, something interviewees, and I conducted a bunch of interviews for my research, kept bringing up with me was the possibility that this form of crime is going to spread to other countries. And we've begun to see more activity from places like Brazil, Iran, China, et cetera. So when thinking about a long-term approach to this problem, I think definitely transnational partnerships are going to be key.
Excellent. Sherry?
Of course, I agree with the previous speakers, but a little bit of a different dimension for the energy sector, for the electricity grid in particular. Of course, we think in terms of the North American grid. So we have existing partnerships for critical infrastructure protection and resilience with our partners, Canada and Mexico. It's all interconnected. So we already have that framing in place for the energy sector. So it makes sense to have international partnerships from that standpoint. And of course, agree with the previous comments that given that certain states are known harbors of criminal behavior and are, if not providing the direction and impetus, are certainly providing the cover of criminal enterprise within their borders. So we have to make this part of the international dialogue to be able to counter the problem.
Perfect. And finally, Mick from DOJ. I think this is a softball over to you, and then.
Yeah, I've been winding up over here for a while. I could take the rest of the panel on this one, but I mean, let me mention just a couple of things. Obviously, this administration thinks that international is critical to solving this problem. So you saw the National Security Council launch the Counter Ransomware Initiative. It has almost 36 countries, and it's multi-layered. There are actually 5 different work streams within the CRI, and one of them is specifically targeted on public-private partnership. So exactly what you were talking about in this report is something that government said, yes, that's right. We're going to do something about it, and we're going to do it at the highest levels. The White House leading that. At the law enforcement level, we have plenty of international relationships. I have almost a dozen people deployed around the world helping to build capacity in other countries to fight cybercrime. But one of the issues, as some of the panelists have mentioned, is that there isn't the political will to address cybercrime in every place. We have, for a long time, have said that really there ought to be minimum requirements for both substantive cybercrimes, attacks and intrusions on computers, and the ability to investigate those, and the ability to cooperate with others who are investigating those things. That has been enshrined in the Budapest Convention, and the United States remains a big proponent of that. But the audience may be interested that a very different type of organization now has taken up this issue, the United Nations. That is not the multi-stakeholder consensus model that has well served the internet for these past several decades. This is a state-run organization where votes are taken. And while we are very much glad that the UN agreed to invite multi-stakeholder participation, and we have some of the negotiating sessions in Vienna, which has a practice of building consensus, this is still a place where Russia and China are pushing a statist agenda for the internet that we very much need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you very much. I think that covers the observation 1.1. I'd like to move on to observation 1.2, and I'm going to open this generally to the panel. And what this observation found, and I think it's people understand it, it's important to implement stronger defense mechanisms and use updated and secure software to making it more difficult to work. It's the basic stronger defense, but it comes down to how do we share that data faster and how do we move it, as General Alexander would say, machine speed, basically to deal about it. It's moving from not just detection, but it has to be deterrence. And this is where this observation comes in. So not just intrusion detection, but intrusion deterrence so that it can't hit. So that's part of the goal. So I know from the government's point of view, it's hard for them to understand what the threat is if they don't know what's going on. And you can't share that common threat around if it's difficult to share it. We'll get into that in the next observation. But to the panel, it's like comments or thoughts around just that stronger defense mechanisms. How do we approach it? So intrusion prevention is really what this is coming out of, the need for not getting there in the first place versus detecting it once it's on the network.
If no one's going to jump on it, I'll jump on it first and maybe trigger some thoughts.
There we go.
I think, this is not the first time we've seen when technology creates capabilities that then require new solutions, not just in terms of defense, but also in terms of deterrence and making it expensive. You look at what happened when the car came along and you now have interstate crime and you actually have people now are able to rob banks outside of their states. That led to the idea that we had to have a fingerprint database. That also led to the idea that we also could have explosive die packs or other methods that would slow the criminals down if they were trying to do their crime. And so I think if we looked at a digital realm, recognizing it's not a one-to-one correlation, but what can we do to make it more costly for would-be ransomware people as they attempt to semi-automate, if not fully automate their activities? How do they know if what they're doing is actually going to result in a payoff or not? How do they know if it's actually even legitimate? I mean, one of the things that was actually talked about in 2009, 2010 with measuring and mapping cybercrime was, do we need to have the equivalent of 50,000 fake grandmas with their credit cards that they're not really real, but if anyone actually tries to do anything to that, that tips and cues you. It also introduces a cost equation to the ransomware. And so, recognizing that right now on the internet, TCP/IP, it is an attacker's advantage. There's things that make TCP/IP hard to secure perfectly, but what you can think about is a deterrent strategy that makes it either more expensive or makes it more sort of the calculus that's being done by the ransomware might say, I'm going to do some other thing instead, which of course then means the DOJ and FBI will have something else to deal with. It's a never ending story, like you said, but at least it introduces a cost equation into their calculus for what they're doing.
Right. Mick, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a little outside of my area because, of course, I work, I guess, to use the sort of common phrase, right of boom. I have not yet achieved minority report status where I can stop crimes before they've happened. And I concentrate on the crimes that have happened. But I will say there's a lot of work going into prevention. And, really, CISA has budget increases that I would drool over in order to address the asset response side of things. The other thing I'll say, just as a lawyer, we have prioritized capabilities over security in our legal system, not necessarily in our criminal prosecution system, but in our legal system generally. And I think that the government is starting to come to the realization that market forces may not be sufficient. And in order to achieve an acceptable level of cybersecurity that benefits our national interests, we may need to have some mandatory minimum standards. I personally am somewhat afraid of governments deciding how to secure systems, given the speed with which things change and the variability among different missions and data sets. But I do think we're moving in that direction.
Excellent. So Sherry, I think from the critical infrastructure and perspective of the energy sector, I think it's most mature in that area. So what your thoughts would be on this?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack with the previous comments. I would say that, most of my work is on the left of boom space. We're definitely working better to increase our detection. The energy sector, the electricity subsector in particular, has been kind of out front in this space in some of the sensor platforms that we've had available. in that subsector for a number of years, and we're trying to increase that. Last year, the White House called for a 100-day ICS, Industrial Control System sprint, to increase the sensor platform, particularly in the electricity subsector, and that is being extended to other utilities. I think that will help us with certain detection activities, really critical to counter the threat. But I think we also need to be realistic and lean forward that, utilities, when you think about the incentive structure, the economic incentives, if you will, for criminals, utilities really are, squarely that target, because, we have the need to operate systems 24/7. Availability is the primary goal for water, power. Critical utilities need to be there, and criminals know this, and they know that they can use a smash and grab mentality to quickly hit up those critical entities that absolutely have to have their systems available and get a quick payoff. And I think that's what we're seeing more of, less nation state actors going for really large targets, and more decentralization, smaller criminals looking for the quick score, and those utilities, those elements, hospitals, and the like, that simply cannot operate without 24/7 availability, are a prime target. So knowing that, being able to predict that we're probably going to see more of this before we see less, how does that then help us predict, determine what we should do strategically to counter that? And certainly Department of Justice and disrupting cryptocurrency ability to pay off from ransomware is one, but really hardening our elements within our utility sectors are critical, and that's hard to do. We have thousands and thousands of local electricity, state, municipal, co-ops. It's really highly distributed for water, for power, for critical infrastructure like hospitals. These are really small targets, but if you can do this at scale, as criminals are getting more adept at doing, as the sharing of ransomware as a service becomes more prevalent, the ability to hit up these smaller entities that have less ability to perform basic cyber hygiene, and yet still are a potential payoff. I think we're just going to see get worse before it gets better. So what do we do about that, knowing that that is potentially a trend?
And the interesting thing about that is, especially for critical infrastructures, the approach to protection, there's really two different approaches. You have the information technology community, and then you have the critical infrastructure community. An attack against critical infrastructure community, it means you may be stopping operation. It immediately gets into possible health, safety versus availability of email or corporate systems. And so, being able to stop it, that left a bang, is so critical, so that, you're not shutting things down. And that's a different approach, because it's not, and I bring this up from one of the reports findings that we came out of it, and I'll just highlight it here. The difference is that the way a lot of the schools are teaching information security or cybersecurity now is more from I'd say the IT perspective, like you're doing a general corporate, not necessarily appreciating the critical infrastructure point of view, because if that system goes down, it may take days, weeks to get it back up, because you got to test everything, because there's a safety issue. Anyway, John, any comments on this one?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on the defense subject with three common and problematic misconceptions in this space. The first is that the cost of a ransomware incident is equivalent to the cost of a ransomware demand per payment. I saw an estimate the other day that the average cost of repair after a ransomware attack is $1.2 million. And whether or not a company pays a ransom demand, that price tag is incredibly high. It's a big misconception that if you pay for a decryptor or for a ransomware group to not release your data, all of your other problems are gonna go away. Companies have to pay legal fees, system rebuilds, a whole other host of emergency response costs. The second thing, which is somewhat related, is the idea that all the ransomware actors out there are highly sophisticated, and the victims on the other side of these attacks have no chance of stopping them. The average ransomware attack exploits basic security vulnerabilities, things like password reuse. This is something you guys have in your report, that you describe this as opportunistic, and that's really what it is. So there is an opportunity, if we can raise the average level of defense, It won't attack, it won't stop every attack every time, but it can make kind of this ecosystem more defensible, robust over the long term. And the third misconception is that the colonial pipelines of the world, these high-profile victims paying, seven-figure ransoms, are the most common victims of ransomware attacks. The average victim of a ransomware attack is small to medium-sized businesses. Saw recently 75% of victims make revenue under $50 million, according to data collected by Coveware. So when thinking about, to kind of jump ahead to next steps, one of the big priorities of the government should be figuring out ways to get help at scale to small to medium-sized businesses in the US.
It's a very, very good point. And actually, that's the thing. It's like, how do you get it down to the smaller distributed owners, operators, businesses that are going to be, aren't in the position to invest in large information security, cybersecurity systems and everything like that. All right, moving on to stay on time and on track, get into our observation category 2. And David, if you would kind of take us to 2.1 and start the conversation around that.
Sounds great. Thank you, Trent. And you need to be ready because I'm going to come to you with the first question after I sort of summarize what the observation said. So we're now at the next part of the report, which sort of build on what we just heard, recognizing that, there's probably going to be more before there's less. We talked about how, it's increasingly being attacks of opportunity. I'll give 2 additional data points just to set the scene for objectives observations 2. It's also a case where not only is the aggregate global cost of ransomware is going up, but the average downtime is also going up. 2 years ago, the average downtime was a little bit less than 2 days. Now it seems like the average downtime for a company is a little bit less than 7 days. And then the number of attacks, the average individual 2 years ago was every 40 seconds around the world. Now it's estimated to be every 20 seconds that an individual experiences an attempt. Doesn't mean they're successful, but an attempt. And same thing for organizations. It's gone from every 3 minutes to now every 1 minute, which means there must be some automation as well as other players that are less sophisticated entering into the scene. But that said, these are simply data points. We lack a bigger picture. And so, in order to take effective action, we need a better picture. And what the aggregate observations 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3 of the report said was basically a recognition that first, better uniform reporting and sharing of information is needed. Okay. The next part, though, says that in order to incentivize private organizations to do that, safe harbor and shield laws are needed for ransomware reporting. So if you're going to require it, you also need to protect those that are actually participating and give them confidence that things will be treated with confidentiality. Otherwise, there may be a reluctance to do it because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And then finally, again, back to the idea that we also need to practice as we plan to work together. If you wait to get involved to DOJ and the FBI after a ransomware event, that's too late. As Mike was talking about, there's relationships you need to have in place already. So what are exercises we can do? What are tabletop exercises and other types of activities? So we practice for the fire drill. And so it's not something new for that company. And how do you scale that to smaller mid-sized businesses that may have at most maybe one IT person or even a half-time IT person as well? So Trent, given all the breadth of that, if you were able to wave your magic wand and try to address these things, where would you start if you were making recommendations either for the US or for the world as a whole on how to improve reporting, safe harbor laws, and public-private exercises that actually practice as we plan to work together?
Great question, David. So what I think the answer is we need better reporting. And so I'll put both, so I retired from the FBI, did my career there doing cyber investigations, now in the private sector. So I've seen on both sides of the fence, either as a CISO or as a consultant helping customer. Private sector understands you need reporting, and we understand that the government needs it in order to address it. The problem is there are too many places to report it to, with sector-specific agencies and all this, depending on where you are. If you're in a critical infrastructure sector or just the private sector, who do I tell and how much do I tell them? This is an evolving area where the government's making great strides with the CRI, the recent act that was passed. But really, it's one of those things where, from the private sector point of view, the government needs to get their act together or make it easy to get the information, and then internally make it easier to share it to our friends over at the Justice Department, the FBI, for law enforcement, criminal action. we can go that way, or share it with the intelligence community or the defense community. It needs to be seamless to the private sector, because then it's not an issue. And then that follows into the second point with we got into there needs to be safe harbor and shield laws, because there's a risk. So basically, when you have a company that's hit by ransomware or an intrusion, data stolen, they're getting extorted, that's a traumatic event. And it's whether you're privately held or publicly held, the big issue coming out is, what are my contractual requirements to my customers, to the government if I have that, or are there laws in the book that require me to report it? So the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act requires, if you're in the critical infrastructure, report within 24 hours and within 30 days if you pay a ransom. Well, currently the way it's working is I have an intrusion, I have an event, I have a cyber event that I'm working through. And then if it's actually an incident, that usually triggers reporting on all this action. Depending on what sector you're in, who do I report to and what do I report? But the first thing you're going to want to do is hire the outside counsel, outside incident response company, and then figure out what their position is. This is, and the reason I bring up this long answer is the need for safe harbor. And what I proposed and recommended was it should be Department of Justice. DHS in the US thing gets the reporting, but as a victim, I need not worry about getting in trouble with regulators or other laws on there, because I'm trying to share it with the government. Same thing like a kidnapping. If someone's kidnapped, you want them to come and report it to the FBI, so the FBI can immediately start doing something, report it to Department of Justice. Same thing like this. You want to report it to CISA, you want to report it to, and then they can do their job. But if you're doing that 30-day calculus of whether to report it, that's part of the issue. And I think that's the biggest thing that companies are worried about is, what's my risk? I got to worry about my stock, my customers, my brand. And now is there a chance that the regulators may come after me? We need to remove that. So make it easy to report and safe to report. And a lot of this other stuff, you'll get more information than you need to even worry about.
Excellent. Well, that summarized quite a lot in there, Trent. And I think you hit the nail on the head on how we have to holistically approach this. So Sherry, I don't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but if you were, you talked a little bit about how if DOE, you're thinking about left of boom and things like that. How would you integrate DOE's sort of perspective and activities into this idea of reporting, safe harbor, and exercises that sort of practice as we want to actually move forward?
Yeah, so as Trent lays out, there's a very complicated landscape here, and this is not new. And I would say for the federal government, we've been working on it for a long time of both connecting the internal plumbing and wiring between law enforcement, defense, intelligence, critical infrastructure protection, response and recovery. All of that, recognizing that cyber is different. The way that we are set up in the federal government is to pursue individual missions, and cyber's joint mission. And all of the way that we're structured, individual departments and agencies, individual appropriations, individual oversight, is systematically, not built for this cross-cutting mission. So we've had to kind of break down a lot of barriers to begin to connect that plumbing and wiring internally, so that we can fulfill what I think has been the vision for a while now for the federal government, that a call to one is a call to all. That regardless of whether a compromised entity wants to talk to their local FBI office or DHS or their sector risk management agency, that we're sharing that information amongst the federal partners that our ability that have the empowerment, the authority to take action to do their respective missions. So that's a continuing challenge. We're making progress, but it's a challenge that really, frankly, we haven't had to deal with before because of the complexity and the comprehensiveness of the cybersecurity mission. So that's one. And then also with reporting and collecting information, as I mentioned before, our sensor platform. How are we even detecting indicators of compromise? That also has been a growing. That's been a, I want to say now a multi-decade project to understand, get better fidelity on indicators of compromise, understand what ransomware technical indicators look like. Know what we know, have a better picture. For the federal entities to get that picture. Respecting privacy. It's these are complex multi-stakeholder engagements. We've made a lot of progress. We've added sort of interim roles in the ecosystem, ISACs, ISOWs, entities that can help bring together industry entities, sort of in between, act as a role in between government and industry to convene, bring together those entities to share information in a way that, maybe avoids some of the scary concerns about government or regulators, but whatever way works, that recognizing the need for collective defense. And I think, part of the key, barrier, maybe mental barrier that needs to be overcome is this notion that, you're in this by yourself and that no one else is impacted. I think the impulse for the federal government in understanding that a major entity has been compromised is the first impulse is this something we have to worry about with others? If a colonial pipeline is being hacked, are other pipelines at risk? Are other entities in the pipeline sector and the oil and natural gas subsector, are they at risk? Is this part of a campaign? And that's something that only really federal entities and potentially ISACs are poised to be able to answer. And so sharing that information and having individual entities understand that there is a need for collective action here, and that they would hope if their whether it's their competitor or their utility neighbor next door is compromised with ransomware, they would want to know about it to be able to understand and take action and potentially protect themselves if it's part of a broader campaign. Conveying that message, I think, is really one of the unique value propositions that the government can bring to this whole ecosystem. But it's a work in progress, many moving parts.
Well said. And I really liked what you were saying, Sherry, about that it's really a joint activity, that cyber is a mission that cuts across all functions of both the federal government, but also state and local to a degree. So I'm going to go to John and then to Mick for your thoughts on this. And John, I hope I'm not going to throw you a curveball here, but you talked a little bit about, you had a background that includes reporting and also thinking about the public role. What is the role of the public news reporting? If it's a kidnapping, sometimes you don't want to immediately talk about that, so I'd be interested in your perspectives on this, the balancing between the need to actually let the public know about the state of ransomware problems, but also not at the same time to feed right into the fear that if I share something, then maybe something bad's going to happen to my company.
That's a great kind of question that gets to the ethics of this, and I'm going to spin this question a different way.
You can.
I don't have a great answer to that one, but as part of this process, so basically, I want to tell an anecdote that illustrates the extent of this reporting problem that we've discussed already. So for this research, I interviewed at one point a ransomware negotiator who started their negotiating career in a corporate environment, working with larger corporate clients. And one day, I forgot the reason why, but they decided to put an advertisement on their website, advertising pro bono negotiation services for small businesses. And in the course of a week, this individual was flooded with an overwhelming number of requests for assistance. That happened about a year ago. I spoke to this individual multiple times in the winter, and they told me the pace of requests from those small businesses has not let up. So that's one indicator of our potential lack of visibility into this problem. I saw recently, it's a little dangerous to pull statistics out of your mind when you have a bad memory, but I think CISA cited 25% that they think that 25% of all ransomware attacks in the United States are reported to them. That's an estimate. I mean, that's bad news, but it's also an estimate. It's possible that the true number, they're off by a factor of 2, of 10, of 100. We don't know, but whatever the answer is, it has huge public policy implications. So that's why getting this reporting question right is so important. And then different point entirely, as legislators, congressional staffers, the current administration is thinking about how best to kind of draft the devil in the details when it comes to either fleshing out the new Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act or potentially passing future legislation on this issue. I think it's critical to keep in mind what outcome you want to have. So, as you structure things like safe harbor provisions, and as you detail how onerous these reporting requirements are going to be, or how not onerous they're going to be. For example, how much technical information are you going to demand from victims who decide to pay a ransom versus are you just going to ask what the figure was and the date they paid, something like that. Whatever you choose to do in terms of drafting those provisions is going to give you different results on the output side. If you have, weak safe harbor provisions and or onerous reporting requirements, you might have lower overall visibility, but on the reports you get, you might have high granularity that could help prosecutors track down cyber criminals. On the flip side, if you make these reporting requirements less onerous and you're kind of just asking for the amount of the ransom, the date of the ransom, things like that, and it's something that small businesses can actually comply with quickly, you might sacrifice some of those prosecutorial investigative advantages, but you might get a very high visibility, high fidelity picture of what's happening in the United States. So, I don't have the perfect answer. I have an opinion, but that's something that the people who are working on this in the current administration should be thinking about.
Well said. And I really liked how you pointed that, in order to first deal with the problem, we have to understand the extent of how bad it is, and that requires a better visibility. And I want to remind our audience that please, if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A function to submit your questions to us. This is going to be a longer than an hour program, so we are going to circle to your questions. I'm trying to integrate them, as is Trent. And then two, I now want to go to Mike and recognizing you have a near impossible mission that you're trying to do your best with. What in the area of reporting would make your life easier?
First, just getting them. So we're not getting all of them now, and there's been a lot of work that has gone in to try to improve that. I do think that you saw the administration support the idea of preservation of privilege for reports, so that you're not in a worse off place by telling the government what happened. I also think that Sherry had talked about the call to one as a call to all. You should be able to expect that your federal government talks to one another within the organization. But we have pushed this idea of a call to one as a call to all, with the sort of corollary to that also being there is no wrong door. So if you have a relationship with your sector risk management agency, with your local FBI field office, your next door neighbor is a Secret Service agent on the cyber squad, somebody from CISA, from a conference you went to, you can go to anybody. And then it's our job to coordinate. I think that has proven to be confusing to people. We thought we were being accommodated. We may have been less than crystal clear. So I think there's been some thought about where is the right place to direct people, even if it isn't the exclusive place. The problem with making it the exclusive place is that the information sharing within the government isn't always perfect, seamless, and timely. And so we do have to address that as well. We also have to address the plethora of different types of reporting requirements that are out there. They are important. They serve different functions. The SEC wants to protect the markets. The sector risk management agencies want to protect the critical infrastructure. Law enforcement wants to catch the bad guys. CISA wants to make sure everybody else is protected against the same threats. Lots of different interests being served. And so there's actually now a cyber incident reporting coordination council at the federal level, understanding that there are state regulations as well, but that is trying to reduce the burden of the overlapping requirements to the greatest extent we can, while preserving the maximum utility of the reporting for the variety of different purposes that those serve. The last thing is, I can't get away without a commercial. After you're done reading the Atlantic Council report, please go to cybercrime.gov, which is my section's website. We have a lot of resources. You heard Dr. Bray talk about the importance of being prepared for a cyber incident before it happens. We have a document there to help you think through those things. There's information on cyber threat intelligence. There's information on vulnerability disclosure programs. There's also best practices for incident response, including the tabletops that you're talking about, that it can help set you up with your local InfraGuard chapter, your local electronic crimes task force that the Secret Service runs, and be prepared ahead of the incident.
Well said. And if I can just emphasize, the best time to have a relationship with the DOJ is before you need it. And if you don't have one in place, again, what Mick said about the website, to look at that and educate and build that relationship today, that is one concrete step that anybody can do if they have a mid-sized company, a large company, even if they're a nonprofit. Do it today because you don't want to be doing it in the midst of the crisis. All right, Trent, over to you now for bringing it home for observations 3.1 and 3.2.
I'll do that. And with it, I'll also do a plug for my friends over at CISIT, the DHS, as a blank holder over there. Basically, and actually from the private sector, really get to know what they have. The CIS has a ton of resources for protection, and they're constantly putting the frameworks on. I was really impressed working with them over the last 2 years and what they're offering. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going all the way up to the administration, what they're doing with the CRI, and Mr. Inglis is doing as the cyber director. Really, that you recently, as somebody who's been here for the last 20 some years doing this and seeing the evolution of the country, I mean, it's happening, but we need to make it happen. Anyway, so with that being said, and plug aside, observation 3, basically it comes into cryptocurrency. So you can't talk about ransomware without crypto. So with cryptocurrency, it's like the whole purpose of cryptocurrency was to create a non-regulated methodology to share funds worldwide to support activities that governments traditionally don't approve on, people don't approve of, or straight out illegal. And one of the observations we had was that, basically it was encouraging, and which I think is already going on, is U.S. government to get coordinated to work with Justice, National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, work with SEC, try and bring together the whole discussion around cryptocurrency. Do we need a U.S. central digital currency, U.S. cyber CBDC, so central bank digital currency, or do we need a stable coin? Because this is basically how do you regulate it. And once there's a stable way of doing business, then it's a lot easier for law enforcement and prosecutors to go after the ones that aren't doing good things. So that was the first observation, is that basically collectively, I think we need to get a united effort towards cryptocurrency. And the second question really comes into to pay or not to pay. So, basically if you're the victim of a ransomware attack, your business, you're in a critical infrastructure sector, now you got to do that calculation. Do I pay the ransom or not? So let me turn this over first to John, see his point of view on cryptocurrency, the central bank concept versus stable coin, and to pay or not to pay. I'll give you kind of a broad brush, and then we can always dial in. And this should generate a lot of discussion. John?
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack there. Listen, on the cryptocurrency side, I'm just going to put some provocative thoughts out there, I guess. One of the problems with cryptocurrency is that this is a global market, and regulating it is incredibly difficult because you have exchanges domiciled in foreign countries that are actively adversarial to the United States, or simply see a market advantage in having low regulation. So there's a lot of practical obstacles to cryptocurrency regulation. From a kind of theoretical perspective, I think something that tends to be overlooked is that when you think about interventions at the monetization layer of an extortion scheme, there's kind of a logical flaw, which is that if the government interdicts payments, you risk harm to the victim, because then ostensibly the victim is not going to be able to get the decryption key that they pay for if the government comes in and intercepts or interdicts the payment before it gets to the criminal, except for certain very rare circumstances. And on the flip side, if victims fear that that is the role that the government is trying to play, they may be less willing to share information with the government. So you might be able to do it in certain circumstances where kind of everything aligns well, but at scale, it's probably not going to be a perfect solution to this problem. Now, that said, there's also, we always focus when we talk about cryptocurrency on kind of the nexus between the victim and the criminal, but criminals also use within these groups cryptocurrency as a vehicle for paying each other. I mean, there was this really fantastic series called it was after a ransomware group, a disgruntled member of the ransomware group following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The ransomware group stated its love for the Putin regime, and a Ukrainian member of the group disaffected and then leaked all this internal chat logs from the group. And a journalist, not me, somebody else, Brian Krebs, went in and did this whole series kind of looking at everything they could find. And they have this whole piece talking about kind of the I don't know, banality, the bureaucracy of the cybercrime groups, which have, up to 80 people on staff at one point, have payroll on the 1st and 15th of each month, have, regular working hours, et cetera, et cetera. But on that payroll issue, the way they distribute payroll to a decentralized network of potentially anonymous members amongst each other is using cryptocurrency. So there's other ways that you can approach this cryptocurrency side of the equation when you're thinking about disrupting these groups and kind of introducing some sort of friction into their business model. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So, Mick, I'll go over to you next on cryptocurrency and your thoughts regarding our efforts as a government, and then to pay or not to pay.
So I'll take the second one first, because the government has a pretty clear message about it, and that is that we can't encourage you to pay criminals. There's a variety of reasons for that. One is you may not actually get what you paid for. You may not be able to be restored quickly if you pay. If you pay, you might be actually incentivizing others to become victimized. You're providing resources to criminals who use it to further crime, and you're telling the criminals, this pays, do it. The economists in the crowd will quickly spot the flaw in that argument, but it is not without some merit. And look, the bottom line, though, is there isn't currently a law prohibiting these payments, with the exception of if you are paying a prohibited entity who's been sanctioned, and that is reasonably rare. So it becomes your choice about what to do. We aren't there to police your decision whether to pay. We want to provide you with the appropriate information so we can tell you, this is a group that is just attacking you again. Once they learn that you are willing to pay, you go to the top of the list to be re-victimized. So we're trying to be value add rather than directive when it comes to payments as US policy stands right now. That policy could change, but it hasn't in the time that I've been doing this. And I think that we can be very helpful. So again, it comes back to the please talk to law enforcement and take advantage of what they can offer you. We can even, in some cases, retrieve the payment. I can't say that that's happened often enough, but it has happened to the tunes of millions of dollars being retrieved. So please do talk to us. As far as the central bank currency, that is for another part of government. I have my own views about the wisdom of providing a safe, transparent, regulated alternative that preserves the best features of digital assets while making it less likely that the ones that don't adhere to the rule of law will grow to a size where they endanger us. I think Trent would probably validate. We were making most of our cybercrime cases off the money trail 10 years ago. They're taking our last lifeline for protecting people from crime away from us if cryptocurrency goes the way of the internet and it becomes a safe haven for anonymity, unchecked power in the individual with no ability for governments to impose the public interest on that system. So I think it's supremely dangerous.
Now, thanks, Mick, on that. And I'm going to go to Sherry next and then wrap up with David on this one specifically. But I mean, this is where, like, and on the roundtables for people watching, this is really with that pay or not to pay being the business decision, but also that rolls back up into that safe harbor. So you're eliminating that whole, hey, something happened, of course I'm going to call the authorities. That's what they're going for. Which and then the first rule of any investigation is follow the money. So with cryptocurrency being in a immutable ledger, like to an FBI agent, that's just, we have a whole bunch of CPAs that just love that. So and a lot of people in the government do it. So thank you, Mick. Sherry, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the good news story here is that we've had a couple of high-profile instances where FBI, DOJ, Treasury has been able to go after ransom payments and recover a certain amount of those. But that is very much a factor of time. So this helps us make the business case for individual compromised entities to report to the government. That if they do that in a timely manner, that dramatically increases FBI's ability to potentially recover some or all portion of a ransom that's been paid. So I think the more that we can communicate, show those instances where the FBI has been successful, and advertise them, and help demonstrate the value proposition for notifying the government. We can help. There's no guarantees, but certainly there have been these noteworthy examples. So I think more of that just helps the virtuous cycles that we're looking for to help better protect the entire ecosystem. I think with payment, non-payment, the fact that the government hasn't been able to develop a policy on this speaks to the complexity and difficulty of the issue. I think painting all entities, small, large, regardless of critical infrastructure or sector, I just don't think that there's a single solution, and that's reflected in the lack of prescriptive rules in this area. So I think we're still learning, we're still getting experience here, but I agree certainly with Mike's points that classically for any kind of ransom, regardless of whether it's ransomware or ransom kidnapping, paying the bad guy, the incentive structure there, it just, and that you might not get what you're paying for, get your restoration. I just think the facts of the situation point to non-payment as the best answer, but everybody has to evaluate this for themselves. We haven't been able to come up with a government-wide position on this, and I think that just speaks to the complexity of the problem.
And David, your thoughts?
All right, I get to be the one that brings it home after everyone's great remarks.
Right.
So I'll try to amplify what folks said and do it from the perspective of increasing costs of the bad actors. And so for the pay to not to pay, as Mike and Sherry have said, if you pay, you did nothing to increase the cost of the bad actors doing it to you again or others in your sector. And if anything, you just now went on the list of that company pays or that organization pays. And so, I know it's painful, and I know sometimes you're going to say, I really need that data. But, if you were that dependent and you got yourself in that situation, maybe you need to get through the pain as opposed to paint a permanent bullseye on your organization. It's also worth noting that criminals are not known for deconflicting their attacks. So there's no guarantee that someone's not going to do something a week later to you, not knowing that you just had it happen. And so I would approach it simply from a cost perspective. But that also gets to the question about cryptocurrencies, because as you said, cybercrimes in the past, you could get them on payments. But what we're doing now is we're moving into a world in which we're making it frictionless. And when there's no friction, don't be surprised if it continues to increase in what's happening. I mean, at least with a cash dollar bill, that has weight, that has volume. And if someone's trying to actually collect it, they actually have to leave the country with it. Whereas it's a lot easier with crypto. It doesn't have weight. Now, not all cryptocurrencies are created equal. As you said, Trent, contrary to what people think, Bitcoin is no built-in privacy protection. Now there's hops you can do and things like that. And you can maybe go to platforms that maybe will try and obfuscate your actions, but not all cryptos are created equal. There are others, unfortunately, that say, we're not going to have anything at all in terms of traceability. And I think that then points to the US needs to think about a strategy that puts forward everything that has the value of a dollar bill, in terms of the dollar bill does not tell you that Trent had it before David had it, before Mike had it, before Sherry had it. But at the same time, when I go and I put down $10,000, that might make you ask questions about, who are you? How did you bring this into the country? What are you? We need to have something that basically is trying to do privacy, but also compliance at the same time. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen. And it needs to be something where whole of government is talking about it. As Mike said, just like how probably with the central bank digital currency, I would defer to our geoeconomics colleagues at the Atlantic Council. It is a treasury-led conversation that needs to happen, but it needs to be informed by law enforcement. It needs to be informed by CISA and others as they think about it, because if they're not at the table, Treasury may either A, roll out something that will make their jobs harder, or B, they may not move fast enough. And so we are seeing the erosion of the ability to do things with a current system at the same time when frictionless things are coming out. So I think there's an opportunity cost that if we do not move out something in the next 2 years, I think Mike's only going to have more gray hair, if hair at all, as the challenge gets worse. And so I think this is why it is so key to have a conversation about what can we have, and it doesn't have to be government run. In fact, my own personal preference, it shouldn't be government run, but it should be encourage the private sector to put forward solutions that are equivalent with a dollar, that it has privacy, but also compliance checks with banks that works with the existing system. And then that allows the government to say, okay, now we're going to start putting out the hammer that says you shouldn't use these specific cryptocurrencies because they're abetting bad actors. There are options out there that give you everything you want. If we see something that's happening like that, there's no reason why you should use it. But you can't bring out the ban hammer for certain cryptocurrencies at the moment because there's no better alternative at the moment, and there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction from the private sector. And so this, to me, is a message that we need to hustle on the Treasury front with DOJ, with CISA and others, and DOE too, informing what they're doing. Because if we don't move forward in the next 2 years, then shame on us, because we just essentially did nothing to introduce costs to the bad actors.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So I know that I'm breaking format here, but
No.
Go ahead.
This is where we go into it. Now we're in the Q&A. We can.
I am really interested in this idea. I have proposed for a while to a number of different colleagues in government that there ought to be a regulated alternative that had certain protections for even reversibility of transactions, where our law could determine who owns something instead of brute math. And I have been told over and over again by the techno-optimists, some might call them techno-anarchists, that no one wants that. And more than not wanting that alternative, the argument I'm even more concerned about is that the existing cryptocurrencies have essentially achieved escape velocity. They're too large. There are too many vested interests in them that providing an alternative would not necessarily drive movement to the regulated alternative. And I wonder, from talking to people in the community and thinking about it, what you think.
So I'll go first because I love that question, Mike. And I would say what they shared with you is true for probably 95% of the industry, but there is 5% that actually are putting forward solutions. And I would say the good news is this last year has not been a good time to buy Bitcoin. So escape velocity has gotten a hold, which might mean now is the time to act before it goes back up, that you have this narrow window of time when, surprise, surprise, the economy is not doing well. Let's act now. There are people that want to have the privacy that a dollar bill currently affords, but are also recognizing that we don't want to embed bad actors. I mean, and if anything, Ukraine has illustrated this. If you're sending funds to Ukraine, you want them to be kept in a way that doesn't reveal the Ukraine activities to, say, Russia. But at the same time, the last thing you want to do is end up funding a nonprofit that's posing as Ukrainian nonprofit that's really Russia and hasn't done any KYC checks, know your customer checks. And so it's interesting that the desire for some, and I know the type that you talk about, the I don't need no stinking government type that say, I don't trust anybody, I want maximum privacy, also at the same time don't want to embed bad actors that are hiding underneath the umbrella of privacy. And there are solutions. And I think what we could do is afterwards, maybe through the continued conversations that Trent mentioned with this, we can begin to bring those people to you, because I think there is a third way. And if anything, because right now has not been a good time for Bitcoin, if we can put out things, and again, it should not be done by the government. I think it should be you allow people to put forward solutions. And much like how things have FDIC labels, there needs to be something that says this is backed in a way that other cryptocurrencies aren't. And therefore it has some guarantees from the US government, but it's a private run horse race in which we're trying to look for a certain type of horse.
No, I think you'd have probably 80-90% of the population using those over, and then from a DOJ point of view or law enforcement, you're focusing on the bad actors, not the good actors, because that kind of takes care of itself. That's a great thing. We have some questions, some good questions from the audience. I think now would be a good time to start going into it. And basically, from one question we have is North Carolina, Florida have banned government entities from paying ransoms connected to ransomware. New York, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Texas have introduced bills doing the same. Do you think more states should ban government entities from paying ransoms? Thoughts?
I think we just answer that in the idea that if you do that, you might disincentivize people from reporting. And so leave it to the, inform the entities, but if you ban it, it may actually discourage the type of behaviors you want.
Yeah.
So on the private sector, agree. There's a lot of reasons why that could drive negative behavior, but to the extent the question focuses on whether government entities should pay, it is, again, a very difficult issue. I am not a local government who has to run their local government when it may have important law enforcement files locked up or something else. So I don't want to say I can anticipate every situation and say there's never an instance where even a small payment to a relatively benign yet criminal group would be in the public interest. But in the large, I think as a federal government, we have said we're not going to pay.
Yeah.
The hope is that means that we are less of a target because they have more confidence that the U.S. government means what it says when it makes a statement like that. We'll see how that plays out. But for the United States government, we have said we won't pay.
Right. And another question we got was, how would the safe harbor to DOJ work with legislation specifically mentioning CISA? So how does the safe harbor kind of framework, if we were to legislate this, look?
I mean, maybe I can take a shot at that as the DOJ are here. I think, Trent, you had mentioned that you thought that the reporting should go to DOJ. I think you saw Congress's judgment that it wanted the reporting in the first instance to go to a CISA-run platform, but then be immediately, without stripping of unnecessary information, go to certain other parts of the government that need immediate unrestricted access to that information, and that includes the FBI. So how does the preservation of privilege work? It works however Congress says it works. And what I think we have supported and Congress has done with its most recent legislation is say, look, if you report as required to whomever that might be, you don't lose a privilege that you had. We're not going to vouch for privileges because you're in a better position to evaluate what privilege you have. And the federal government isn't going to validate that you had a privilege just because you gave it to us. It becomes privilege. That's not the idea. You're just in no worse off shape. So you're not going to have waived your privilege by complying with your reporting requirement. And that's really the basis. We're not helping you protect information. If you didn't comply with some obligation under a contract, if you didn't do something that you should have done, you didn't meet your minimum security standards, even minimum security standards that you promised to the Department of Justice, because we buy a lot of tech and we have a cyber civil fraud initiative that says, if you lie to us about what you sold to us, you may be liable for that. So we're not protecting people's bad conduct. We're not incentivizing low security, but we're saying, don't be worse off because you told us what happened.
Right.
One important nuance there, if I understand things correctly, in the new cyber incident for critical infrastructure reporting bill, there is a provision that states that the reports themselves cannot be used to predicate legal or regulatory action against the entity that reports, which is a really important provision that I think industry pushed for and would be important to getting the levels of compliance that would really be valuable in this space.
No, that's a very good point, because as we did this roundtable in context, everybody is like, this was done before the act came out and concurrently kept going. But I think that's really, you want to remove that fear of reporting. Now, if you still did bad stuff, you gotta, it is what it is, as I would say. But that's as we're going forward. Okay, so following on that, Mick, we have another question. What does the USG need to go after the bad actors through an international legal or administrative framework? Can you talk about how you chase down people, what we are doing, because a lot of people don't realize what's going on behind the scenes, and kind of give this framework, because ransomware is transnational crime. So,
I mean, we've got to do so many things, right? One thing we have to do is hire enough people to be doing all the things that need to be done. My office is roughly the same size as it was 10, 15 years ago, but this administration has said we are using the money Congress already gave us to take from other priorities, because that's how it has to work, but give you more bodies. We got money when ransomware became big. They said, we'll take people from other offices, we'll send them to CSIPs. The Ukraine effort, we're actually assisting quite a bit in that. And ransomware and cybercrime is a big piece of what is happening in Ukraine, not just not equivalent to the Russian invasion, and I wouldn't dare say that, but it's also an important priority that we're helping to address on the electronic evidence side and in the cybercrime side. And they said, Congress appropriated new money. We're going to take some of that and we're going to give that to CSIPs. So we're finally growing. What else do we need to do? We need to train and retain our people. CISA and DOD can pay more than the Department of Justice. The private sector pays much more than either of those two entities. We need to address the skills gap with education and the retention problem with giving people not just a great mission and a great workplace, but the benefits personally that come from their work. We've got to be out there raising awareness in other countries with the State Department. We've got to be building capacity in our partners. We announced that we're going to have a Cyber Operations International Liaison, the COIL. The COIL is going to be out there directly interfacing with foreign law enforcement to plan international operations. Like you saw us take down the Emotet botnet. Yeah. And I say us because it really wasn't just the US. Yeah. There were a lot of countries involved. And I would dare say Germany led that effort with assistance from the United States. We want to enable those sorts of cooperative actions to deal with the infrastructure that cyber criminals use. Personally, again, I keep saying personally, you obviously invited me for DOJ's perspective, but I can't help but giving a few personal things. Personally, I also think we need to not increase penalties for cybercrime, because honestly, the ones that get caught really wouldn't have done it if they knew they were going to get caught. We need to raise the number of people getting caught. And there's a lot of pieces to doing that, including the international cooperation piece that we're working really hard at. But it's too easy for Congress with no money to say, we're going to address cybercrime. Instead of 20 years in jail, you'll get 30 years in jail or life in jail. That's not going to solve this problem if we're not catching enough people for people to fear getting caught.
Interesting. Thank you, Mick. Well, we got another question that I just want to, I think, tags on to that on the reporting and safe harbor. Is the question was recent T-Mobile data breach and corresponding lawsuit for $350 million. I think we kind of already answered that, and you hit that, Mick, where it's like if you weren't meeting, whatever your level of security is and the basis lawsuit, any lawsuit can happen at anything, but it's that reporting going forward. I don't know if anybody want to add further comments on that. No. Okay, we'll leave that there.
Trent, let me just say this, and I know I've been talking a lot, so I'm sorry to my fellow panelists.
I know, Counselor.
One thing I will say is that these are the sorts of things that boards and decision makers are thinking about when they're thinking about whether to make public that they were the victim. Let me tell you, it will only get worse if you are not forthcoming. The story isn't that T-Mobile had to pay $350 million. The story is that you can control the narrative if you decide to report, and you can mitigate the damages, and you can make sure that regulators treat you as someone who was cooperative and forthcoming, which regulators have done with some frequency. The FTC, the SEC, they've made statements that say, we treat a company better if they proactively work with law enforcement. The idea that if you just say nothing, no one will learn of it and you'll be safe from these lawsuits, that's a pipe dream. Brian Krebs is going to find out.
Or John. So, okay, with that, so we are getting close to the end of our timing, and I wanted to go around the room really quick on our final question. Over the horizon, where do you think we're going? And I'll start with Sherry, kind of go over the horizon, ransomware, response, future threats, kind of open up. It's an easy ball. What do you think over the horizon we're going to look from, whether it's a year, 5 years, 10 years? Your call.
Yeah, I think, just kind of tagging onto my previous comments, unfortunately, I think for critical infrastructure that, requires 24/7 availability, we're going to see more rather than less. And maybe I'll even loop in the last question here. I don't necessarily see that ransomware has, you don't see the same dynamic between major nation states and criminals. They're operating under similar impulses, but also, ransomware as a service is now, it's a thing. The availability of, the as a service model to commit crimes, makes that route accessible to even smaller entities. So I don't know that there's really a nation state dimension for ransomware in the same way as other types of cyber attacks. So, and I think, we're going to see, because you're making it easier for criminals, you don't have to have technical savvy. You have a, technical support help desk to help you with your ransomware. You have this, the ability to share the proceeds of your ill-gotten gains with, the as a service model. I think, that's going to continue to evolve, and we're going to see more of that. And I think also there's an optimization that's happening that criminals are seeing that, if you try to ransom too much, multi-millions of dollars, you're disincentivizing paying. So you want to try to get just as much as possible, a couple $1,000. And if you can do that at scale, now you have an economic model that's viable. So we're going to see those kinds of economically focused incentive structure play out. And but the good news there is there's a certain predictability about that. So as we understand those models evolving, how do we then effectively counter that? And I think it's all of the things we've talked about. It's better detection, better sharing information, but better also preparation. I think ultimately, not just making sure that you're doing those, very unsexy cyber hygiene things like regularly backing up your data, and not just backing it up, but reconstruct your enterprise from the backup. That's where you really learn things. So
Exactly.
I think, unfortunately, more of the same, but knowing this, we need to just continue doing more of what we're doing, learn lessons, and counter the bad guys.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I kind of like to emphasize your last point on restoring backups. So a lot of companies, governments do restoration as a service. They either have it out, more people are doing it as a service than in-house, and can you actually restore? Because that's probably the first level of defense on a ransomware attack, is being able to get back in operation. And a lot of times it doesn't work. So next, I'd like to go to John. And so over the horizon, you just finished your report. You're in final editing, going to publish here in August. From your research, where do you think we're going? What's going to happen?
The short answer to where is ransomware going is nowhere. It's going to remain a problem for a long time to come. One important kind of caveat, term definition I want to introduce, even though it's very late in this discussion, but that's important. In my paper, I focus on profit-motivated criminals using ransomware in targeted / opportunistic attacks against organizations. And that's what I think is a long-term problem. When we have these discussions about ransomware, ransomware is a relatively fluid term, but sometimes we lump in things like WannaCry and NotPetya. What stands out and really captivated me about ransomware, this kind of modern iteration, is that we're talking about how profit-motivated criminals have become a national security threat, even though they don't really intend to be. And that is because of how lucrative this market is. I don't think we're ever going to stop other states from, if they want to use ransomware as a tool of statecraft, they can do that. There's another set of tools to stop that. But what really interests me, and I think is a long-term problem in this country and in other U.S. allies is criminal deployment of ransomware for driven by profit but producing national security harms.
Great, thank you. And then Mick, any thoughts? Where are we going? Over the horizon?
Yeah, I definitely want to validate John's point that, look, the tools are different to deal with financially motivated, loosely organized criminal groups than they are for nation states. And one of the problems is when people talk about the blending of the threat or the convergence of nation state and cyber criminals, those are all valid things. It doesn't change the fact that the tools that we have to deal with different types of actors and that are effective against different types of actors are different. So I start with that. But look, if you want to know where DOJ thinks we're going, we just issued a comprehensive cyber review that tells us where our department leadership and experts thinks we're going. So I would refer you to that report. There's a lot of great content in it. Everything from the emerging threats that we're dealing with now with IoT devices and connected cars and unmanned aerial systems, up to the stuff that is more emerging and not in widespread use quite yet, like artificial intelligence, and setting the standards that governments, including our own government, but other governments should use when dealing with such a powerful new technology like artificial intelligence, all the way up to post-quantum computing. So I guess to leave you with a little bit of optimism, know that your government understands the need to address these emerging threats. The department is creating an emerging technology board to make sure that at least across the department, we are thinking about all of the different ramifications of these new technologies. And at the end of the day, our goal is to be good enough for government work.
Right.
And if people don't understand the origin of that phrase, it was not a slur as something suboptimal but good enough for government work. It came out of World War II when people were creating products that they knew our soldiers' lives depended on. Mm-hmm. And so when they were in that factory creating something, they knew it had to be good enough for government work when lives were on the line. And that's what we're doing.
Great, thanks. And finally, David, my co-author, as we do as we wrap up the report, thank you to everybody for your time today. Thank you for the panel and the report. David?
Thank you, Trent, and thank you as fellow co-author as well. I'll be brief because I know Lloyd wants to wrap it up.
Yep.
I'll say 3 trends are happening on the bad guy side. Increased automation. They're already moving to semi-automated methods. John referenced a report in which it's actually being run like a business. More and more automation to make things then result in increased efficiency. We know, for example, GPT-3, an algorithm that can write text, can actually write phishing emails that are more effective than human-generated phishing emails. So they're going to be bringing in AI and automation, and the net result is going to be increased speed of attacks, which is going to mean that we also have to increase our speed. Now, on the good news side, and that's where I'm really resonant with what Mike was saying too about how the DOJ and others are approaching it. We should see the private sector start to roll out anti-ransomware as a service, because now it's at the price point where actually small to mid-sized businesses, they can't afford their own cybersecurity, can actually subscribe to this service, including virtual desktops that actually mitigate the attack. That leads to the second thing, which is making your attack surface more confusing. There's already talk about zero trust, but I think the next thing after zero trust is near zero exposure. And so your attack surface, instead of staying static, is making it more difficult for anyone to do reconnaissance and launch the attack. And then lastly, I'll be controversial and say, I am really optimistic that we may eventually have a true cyber reservist model for the United States, and perhaps building on the National Guard as one team, one mission. That could be both people at the local and state level, but also across the federal government, because now this is at a point where it actually is something that's not just ransomware, but as Sherry said earlier, it's really that cyber cuts across missions, cuts across state, local domains, and the federal government. So I'm very interested in how that moves forward. And again, Trent, thank you for everything. And I guess we'll cut now to Lloyd.
Thank you. Lloyd, you want to toss it over to you?
Yes. So thanks everyone for a great discussion. Having spent my prior career as a federal employee, I'm particularly happy we can convene a group like this and help our public servants address a serious global problem. Among all that we hear, two things along that we heard today, I think two things stand out to me from today's discussion. First, that ransomware is a transnational problem. right? It requires global cooperation and public-private partnerships, particularly that can assist small and medium-sized enterprises. And second, a common theme that I'm seeing and we're seeing in the GeoTech Center and many emerging tech areas is the data divide. Policy areas where missing data or barriers to sharing data prevent technology from achieving its potential. In this case, both in terms of understanding the scope of the problem and preventing attacks. And we've heard, particularly in this last summary from David, lots of actionable advice on addressing this divide associated with ransomware. So to close out, thank all the participants for attending. If you haven't already, please download the report and share the link with others in your network for whom ransomware is a concern. Have a good day.